Welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. As always, it's Kay here. Whatever happened today is in the past now. If you're carrying the heavy exhaustion of a long day, it's time to put it all down. You don't have to face the quiet alone tonight. I'm going to be right here with you until you drift off. If making these true horror stories a part of your nightly routine brings you peace, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell. I promise to always have another nightmare waiting for you, every other night. Before the stories begin, I'd be so happy to read where you're tuning in from, and what the clock says where you are. There's something beautiful about knowing we might be listening to these stories at the very same moment, miles apart. Now, pull the blankets up close, dim the room, and let's dive into tonight's first encounter. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing by talking about this, but it's been over 10 years, and I still can't really sleep in a totally dark room without feeling this heavy pressure in the air. I'm the youngest in my family. I had, 2 older brothers. They were twins, Hayes and Thatcher. Our parents raised us strict, hoping we'd grow up to be these peaceful, obedient sons, which is kind of a joke looking back. We grew up in Tianjiang, a sweltering province down south where the river air is so thick it feels like you're breathing warm soup, and you just sweat through your clothes the second you step outside. Even though Hayes and Thatcher were twins, they couldn't have been more different. Thatcher was a brawler. Even when we were like 4 or 5, people around the neighborhood called him a little thug, not in a totally mean way, just he was the kid who would take your toys and punch you if you tried to get them back. But Hayes was quiet. He was incredibly gentle, soft-spoken, and, well, he was gay. He didn't come out or anything, not back then, but by the time he hit middle school, it was obvious. He was skinny, fair-skinned, liked keeping his hair a little longer, and he only ever hung out with the girls. Through elementary school, it was fine because Thatcher was basically the king of the playground. Nobody messed with Hayes because Thatcher would absolutely destroy them. He was fiercely protective of his twin. But when they hit 6th grade, the school separated them into different classes. The teachers knew if they put them together, they'd just talk and goof off, so they split them up. And that's when the nightmare started for Hayes. Without Thatcher there, Hayes became the prime target. It was relentless. He would come home with a bruised eye, ripped shirts, his notebooks completely scribbled over and torn up. And the teachers didn't do crap about it. Some of them even blamed him, saying his attitude, or his softness, provoked the other boys. It was incredibly screwed up. Things peaked in 9th grade. Hayes was about 15. A group of guys beat him so badly he actually passed out and ended up in the school nurse's office. When Thatcher found out, he went completely feral. He tracked down the main guy who did it and cracked his head open so bad, the kid had to go to the hospital. My parents were furious. The school was threatening expulsion, and my folks were actively looking to pull both of them out and transfer them to a different district. But before the paperwork even went through, Hayes died. I was only in 7th grade. I remember my aunt pulling me out of class in the middle of the day. She didn't take me home. She took me straight to the provincial hospital. When I walked into the hallway, I saw my parents and Thatcher just collapsed on the floor next to a gurney, sobbing hysterically. There was a white sheet pulled over the body, and it was soaked in red. The doctors pulled the sheet back for a second so they could transfer him to the morgue, and I saw his face. I saw my brother's face. His head was basically resting sideways on the stretcher, and the angle was all wrong. It looked like a chicken when someone tries to cut its neck but a flap of skin is still holding the head on. His eyes were half open. I completely froze. I couldn't breathe. I was just a kid, and looking at that, it broke something inside my brain. We found out later that Hayes had been severely depressed. He was being bullied. The teachers hated him. And on top of that, we found out he had a secret boyfriend who had just dumped him because of the peer pressure. So that morning, Hayes skipped school. He was just wandering aimlessly along Highway 1A. this massive, unforgiving stretch of highway where truckers and buses blow past at 80 miles an hour. He was walking near the median, and a guy on a motorbike, who was completely blackout drunk in the middle of the day, hit him. But he didn't just hit him. The bike's handlebars or something caught Hayes by the collar, and the guy panicked and didn't stop. He dragged my brother for almost 300 feet down the asphalt. The edge of the metal exhaust pipe just kept digging and sawing into Hayes' neck the whole way. We buried him. The funeral was a blur of crying and chanting, and this suffocating smell of incense that just coated the back of my throat. But the thing is, Hayes didn't really leave. Not right away. In our culture, there's this belief that for 49 days after someone dies, their soul is still tethered here. They wander around, settling debts, before they finally cross over. I thought it was just a fairy tale to scare kids, until I started finding the books. See, Hayes used to read this hardcore gay adult smut, like explicit stuff that a guy, especially living with a hyper-masculine twin like Thatcher, definitely couldn't be caught dead reading. To hide them from our parents, he used to stash them in my room, hidden behind my little pink desk lamp. I didn't care. I just let him keep them there. A few days after the funeral, I came home from school, went into my room to put my backpack away, and saw one of his manga books lying open on my desk. It was flipped to the middle, exactly like someone had just put it down to go to the bathroom. I stared at it, and my brain instantly did that thing where it tries to protect you from going crazy. I just told myself, oh, I must have pulled it out last night while I was grieving and forgot to put it away. I picked it up, feeling my eyes get watery, and shoved it back on the shelf. But then, the next afternoon after I took a shower, I walked back into my room, and a totally different volume was sitting open on my desk. I was getting a little annoyed. I marched over to Thatcher's room and yelled at him for going into my stuff and messing with my books. Thatcher looked at me like I was insane and told me to get lost, saying he didn't give a damn about my stupid girly comics and that only me and Hayes ever touched that garbage. That sent a weird little prickle down my spine, but I just brushed it off. That night, I was lying in bed in the dark. My desk is maybe 10 feet away from my bed. The house was dead quiet. I was just drifting off when I heard it. It wasn't a sudden noise, it was this slow, agonizingly deliberate scraping sound, like the dry pad of a finger dragging across rough paper, followed by the faint thwack of a page turning, and then a few seconds of silence before it happened again. I opened my eyes, and my breath hitched in my throat because my pink desk lamp, the one I had literally unplugged and shoved into the corner months ago, was sitting dead center on the desk, fully plugged in and glowing bright yellow, spotlighting an open manga. I just lay there, paralyzed, watching the book. About 10 seconds passed, and then the page just flipped. It didn't blow in the wind. It lifted up, arced over, and pressed itself flat on the other side. I couldn't handle it. I sat up really fast, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at, and the second I moved, the book just went crazy. The pages started flipping aggressively. Swish, 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 tearing through the rest of the chapters in a blur until the back cover flipped over and the book slammed shut. The instant it closed, the desk lamp snapped off. Pitch black. I sat in the dark, violently rubbing my eyes, thinking I was having a night terror. When my eyes adjusted to the moonlight coming through the window, I could see the book was lying closed on the desk. The lamp was right next to it. It wasn't a dream. I scrambled out of bed, sprinting across the hall to Thatcher's room, practically crying, begging him to let me sleep on his floor because I was terrified. The next morning, I took every single one of Hayes' books, shoved them in a plastic bag along with the lamp, and dropped them in his empty bedroom. The page turning stopped after that. I figured he just wanted his stuff back, but I was so naive. That was just him saying hi to me. What he did to the people who hurt him, that was a whole different level of fucked up. About a week later, this older couple showed up at our house. They looked miserable, just haggard and exhausted. They told my parents they were Thorne's parents. Thorne was the guy who had tormented Hayes for 4 years, the one Thatcher had hospitalized. They stood in our living room, wringing their hands, and begged my parents to let them light incense at Hayes's altar. They said Thorne had basically lost his mind. He hadn't gone to school in 10 days. He refused to leave his room, and every night, he would wake up screaming bloody murder. The mom, shaking, confessed what Thorne had seen on the very first night of Hayes's funeral. Thorne had been sitting by his bedroom window, looking out at the dark street, when he saw a shadowy figure walking toward his house. Thorne was a tough guy, so he opened the window and yelled at the guy to get lost before he came out and beat his ass. But the figure didn't stop. It just kept walking into the glow of the street lamp. And Thorne realized it was Hayes. But Hayes's head wasn't right. As he walked, his head was severely tilted, drooping further and further down with every step until it snapped completely sideways, resting totally flat against his own shoulder. It was the exact horrific injury from the accident, and he was just shuffling toward Thorne's window, staring up at him with dead, half-open eyes. Thorne's parents said they heard a crash and ran into his room to find their tough bully of a son kneeling on his desk, violently slamming his own forehead against the window frame, weeping and begging Hayes to leave him alone. He kept screaming that the boy with the broken neck was inside the walls, crawling on the ceiling, waiting for him in the bathroom. They begged my parents to forgive Thorne, to tell Hayes's spirit to let him go. They lit their incense at the altar. My parents, who are way better people than I am, kindly told the spirit to drop the grudge, but I was the one who cleared the table after they left, and I saw it. The 4 sticks of incense they lit, 2 of them had burned perfectly straight, but the 2 sticks planted by Thorne's parents, they had curled completely backwards, bending into an unnatural U shape, like a twisted, deformed finger, pointing right back at the front door. And as soon as they backed their motorbike out of our driveway, the heavy fruit basket they brought as an offering physically launched itself off the altar, smashing into the floor and taking a vase of water down with it. He didn't forgive them. Not right away. Thorne ended up transferring to a school in a completely different city a week later just to escape the haunting. And it wasn't just him. A few days later, Hayes's homeroom teacher, the one who always moved him to the back of the class and ignored his bullies, came over. She looked terrified. She told my parents that ever since the funeral, no one could sit at Hayes's old desk. Kids were getting poked in the ribs when no one was behind them. Their pencils and books would vanish from inside their backpacks and end up neatly stacked inside the desk's cubby. Some kids would fall asleep in class and wake up screaming because a boy's voice whispered their name directly into their ear. They tried to move the desk to the basement storage, but the janitor mysteriously lost the only key to the storage room the exact day they tried to move it. The teacher lit incense, cried, and apologized. A few days later, the school principal came over and did the same. Only then did the classroom go back to normal. But the most gut-wrenching one was Xavier. Xavier was the secret boyfriend. Nobody in my family even knew he existed until his mother dragged him to our house. Xavier was this big, athletic, masculine guy. You would never guess he was with my brother. But when he sat down in our living room, he kept his arms crossed, and I could see his forearms were covered in these fresh, angry cigarette burns and razor cuts. His mother, looking incredibly ashamed, explained that Xavier hadn't slept in days. He told her that he was waking up paralyzed in his bed. He couldn't move his arms or his legs, and he could feel the mattress dip right beside him. And then, he would feel a hand slip into his. It wasn't a warm hand. Xavier told his mom it felt like a block of heavy, rigid ice shaped like human fingers, locking perfectly between his own fingers. It would grip him so tight his knuckles ached, and a voice would just quietly whimper and cry next to his ear, calling him husband in the dark. Xavier just sat there in our living room, staring at the floor, absolutely petrified. He realized that by breaking up with Hayes to save his own reputation, he had pushed him over the edge. He lit incense, crying silently, and stood in front of the altar muttering apologies for almost 10 minutes. It felt like Hayes was just going down a checklist, hunting down every single person who had wronged him. I started to get really scared of my own brother. I didn't know what he had become. And then, the 49th day arrived. The next morning, the 50th day. I was supposed to go on a huge middle school field trip to Soi Tien. It's this massive, kind of surreal amusement park closer to the city. The tickets cost like 200,000 dong, which was roughly $8 or $10 back then, an absolute fortune for a kid, and my parents had paid for it months before the accident. Even though we were mourning, they told me I should go, to get my mind off things. The night of the 49th day, I went to sleep incredibly excited. I had a dream. I was lying in my bed, and I looked over at my desk, and Hayes was sitting there, reading his manga. He looked totally normal. Not mangled, not dead, just my gentle older brother. In the dream, I sat up and excitedly told him I was going to Soi Tien tomorrow. He stopped reading. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and his face twisted into this mask of absolute, terrifying rage. It was an expression I had never ever seen on him. He pointed a finger at me, and his voice was guttural and overlapping, like three people yelling at once. "You're not going anywhere. I'll burn you up before I let you get on that bus. You stay home. You stay home." He started screaming at me that there was going to be an accident, that he would make me sick, that he wouldn't let me leave the house. I started sobbing in the dream, terrified of him, and I woke up crying for real. The second I opened my eyes, my entire body was shivering uncontrollably. My joints ached and my skin felt like it was radiating heat. It was 4 a.m. I was supposed to be at the school by 4:30. My mom came in to wake me up, took one look at me, and touched my forehead. I was burning up with a 104-degree fever. There was absolutely no way I was going on that trip. I cried bitterly, not even remembering the dream at that point, just devastated that I was missing the water park. I stayed in bed all day, sweating it out. Around 5 p.m., a neighbor down the street came sprinting to our front gate, screaming my mother's name, crying hysterically. My parents ran out. The neighbor was hyperventilating, asking if I had gone on the trip. The bus carrying my classmates, it had crashed on Highway 1A on the way back. A truck had swerved, and the bus driver had to jerk the wheel, slamming the vehicle straight into the concrete median. Over 40 kids were on board. Nobody died, thank God, but the side of the bus was shredded. 5 kids, sitting near the windows, had their arms and legs completely crushed and broken. If I had gone, I would have been sitting right next to my best friend, in the exact window seat that took the hardest hit. When my parents rushed back inside to tell me I was safe, the memory of the dream hit me like a physical punch to the chest. "I'll burn you up before I let you get on that bus." He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just a vengeful spirit terrorizing the town. He was using the last few hours he had on this earth to make sure I didn't end up on that highway with him. After that 49th day, everything stopped. The house felt normal again. The books never moved. The desk lamp stayed unplugged. Thorne and Xavier and the teachers never had another nightmare. Hayes was just gone. I still think about it all the time. Honestly, if any of you listening have ever felt that weird, heavy intuition, or if you've been forced to miss a flight or a trip because of some freak illness that just vanished the next day, please tell me I'm not the only one. Tell me I'm not crazy for believing that someone standing on the other side of the veil reached through and held me back. It brings me a lot of comfort to think he protected me, but it also leaves me with this suffocating guilt, knowing that in his final moments, the world was so cruel to him, and yet his last act was to save me. I guess I just owe him my life now. Thanks for sticking around to listen to my rambling. It feels a little lighter, just getting it out of my head and into the world. If you're out driving late tonight, especially on those dark stretches of highway, just keep your eyes on the road and stay safe. If your college dorm has an abandoned room that management never bothers to padlock, request a transfer immediately. I thought I was just being paranoid back in my freshman year, but I swear to you, some doors are left unlocked for a reason. I'm going to keep the exact name of the university out of this. Just because the school is still operating, the dorms are still packed with students, and I really don't want to start some massive panic for the kids living there right now. But I can tell you it was located in Go Vap, this massively crowded district in Saigon where the alleys are a total maze and the airplanes fly so low you can literally feel them shake the roof. Back in 2013, I was just a freshman. I came from a smaller province, so my parents naturally forced me to live in the campus dorms. You know how it is. Parents think if you're on campus, you're safe, you're managed, you won't get into trouble. The campus itself was huge, but the actual dormitory building was surprisingly cramped. It was just this single tall building, maybe 10 stories high, but the weird part was how they divided it. They split the entire building right down the middle to separate the guys from the girls. I'm talking 2 separate entrances, 2 separate parking lots, 2 separate cafeterias. Down in the parking garage, there was a solid brick wall dividing us. But up in the actual living quarters, it was just a heavy-duty chain-link fence. Like, they painted it to look nice, but it was just a thick metal fence running right down the middle of the hallway to make absolutely sure the guys and girls couldn't mix. I was assigned to room 27. Because of how the math worked out with the hallway being chopped in half, our room was at the absolute dead end of the boys' side. And directly across the hall from us, separated only by a few feet of tiled floor, was room 14, the dead end of the girls' side. There were 4 of us shoved into this tiny room. None of us were from the Mekong Delta, which is kind of rare for students in the city. I had a buddy from Dong Nai, one from Kon Tum, one from Quang Nam, and I was from Bin Tuong. For the sake of this story, since I'm trying to protect their privacy too, let's just call them Victor, Nolan, and Caleb. The first few days were fine. It was actually really fun, just that chaotic, loud energy of a bunch of guys living away from home for the first time. But after a few weeks, everyone settled into their routines. People started skipping classes, going to work, going home for the weekend. So during the day, the dorm would actually get incredibly empty. Like maybe 10% of the students were actually around. It was about a month into the semester. I was feeling a little under the weather. Nothing serious, just that heavy, lethargic feeling where you absolutely cannot be bothered to sit in a lecture hall. I tried to convince the other guys to skip class with me and play some League of Legends, but they actually went to class, leaving me totally alone in the room. It was right around noon. Our room didn't have AC, just this ceiling fan that basically just pushed the hot, humid air around in a circle. It was stifling, so instead of sitting on my top bunk where the air was completely dead, I grabbed this cheap plastic folding table we used for eating, set it on the floor, and sat cross-legged against the frame of the bunk bed. The way I was sitting, I was facing our open doorway, and if I just lifted my eyes slightly over the top of my laptop screen, I was looking directly into the open doorway of room 14 across the hall. Now, room 14 had been empty since the day we moved in. Nobody lived there, but for some screwed up reason, it was never actually locked. The main door and the window facing the hallway were always just closed, but never padlocked. Every now and then, I'd see the security guard come upstairs, grab the handle, and pull it shut with this loud metallic clack, but he never used a key. I always assumed maybe the girls next door were using it to store stuff or something. I don't know. Anyway, I was in the middle of a match. I'm just staring at my screen, sweating in the midday heat, totally absorbed in the game. You know how League works. When your character gets killed, you have this respawn timer where you literally can't do anything for like 15 or 20 seconds. So my character died. I leaned my head back against the metal bed frame, stretched my neck, and just casually glanced across the hall. The door to room 14 was wide open. I didn't really think much of it. The room inside was pitch black because they didn't have their lights on, which was normal since the building's design blocked out almost all natural sunlight. I just figured the guard forgot to close it. I went back to my game. A few minutes later, I messed up and died again. I sighed, looked up from the screen, and my stomach just did this weird slow flip. There was a girl in the room. I could see her silhouette moving around in the dark. She was dressed totally normal, like a college student who just got back from class. wearing a light jacket, long pants. I watched her take off a helmet and hang it on the wall. At least, that's what it looked like she was doing. I honestly just thought, oh, okay. I guess someone finally moved into the empty room. My game pinged, pulling my attention back. I played for another 5 minutes, died again, and looked back up. She was still in there, still pacing back and forth in the dark. But there was something incredibly heavy about her. Even from across the hall, I could feel this suffocating sadness radiating off her. Her head was bowed down, her shoulders slumped, like someone who just got dumped or failed out of school. I kept watching her, completely forgetting about my game, and the longer I watched, the more my brain started to reject what I was seeing. She was pantomiming. She would walk up to a spot where a desk should be, reach out her hand, and make the exact motion of picking up a water bottle, but her hand was empty. Then she'd walk to another corner, reach down, and pretend to lift a heavy pot or a plant, but there was nothing there. She was just gliding around the dark room, touching invisible objects, going through the motions of a life that wasn't there. I actually kind of chuckled to myself, trying to brush it off, thinking she was just some weird theater kid practicing a routine. I watched her slowly turn and walk into the room's ensuite bathroom. She pulled the door shut behind her, and then she just never turned the bathroom light on. I sat there staring at that closed bathroom door for I don't even know how long. Why would you go into a windowless bathroom in a dark room and not turn on the light? About 20 minutes later, the security guard came shuffling down the hall. He stopped at room 14, peeked inside, grabbed the door handle, and slammed it shut. Then he reached over and slammed the window shut, latching both of them from the outside. I just sat there, frozen. He locked the room. He locked the room from the outside, and that girl never came out of the bathroom. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was from room 13 and just snuck over to use the spare toilet because hers was occupied, and maybe she slipped out while I was looking at my screen. You have to understand, your brain will do anything to avoid admitting there's a ghost 10 feet away from where you sleep. I eventually closed my laptop, too creeped out to stay alone, and left the dorm to hang out at an internet cafe until the other guys got back. Late that afternoon, Victor came sprinting into our room. He was out of breath, clutching this stiff, cheap, brand new blanket he'd obviously just bought from the market downstairs. He threw it on the floor and frantically started telling us that we could absolutely not look across the hall anymore. We asked him what the hell he was talking about, and he explained that he was just talking to some upperclassmen. Apparently, when the dorm was first built about 3 years prior, in 2010, it had barely been open for a month when a girl hanged herself inside room 14. Victor told us the school administration hushed it up immediately. They had police come in the middle of the night, completely scrubbed the incident from the records, and threatened the staff to keep their mouths shut because they couldn't afford a mass exodus of students leaving for off-campus housing. Hearing Victor explain that, I felt the blood completely drain from my face. I practically choked on my own spit as I told them about the girl I watched pantomiming in the dark just a few hours earlier, the one who walked into the bathroom and never came out. We were terrified. We immediately helped Victor string up that cheap blanket across our doorway to block the view of room 14. But of course, a couple of days later, the dorm management did their rounds and forced us to take it down, citing fire hazards and aesthetic rules, so the view was wide open again. Now, Victor believed me, but Caleb was our resident skeptic. He didn't outright mock me, but he made it very clear he thought I was just seeing shadows or making up crap because I was bored. He fully believed a girl died there, sure, but he absolutely refused to believe her spirit was still pacing around. But then, a few nights later, it happened to Nolan. Nolan had the bed right next to our window, which perfectly paralleled the window of room 14. We always kept our window open at night because the building had a central air shaft that let a breeze through. Nolan told us the next morning, looking physically sick, that he had woken up in the dead of night, needing to use the restroom. He sat up, totally groggy, rubbing his eyes, and as he turned to swing his legs out of bed, he looked out the window. He said the light in room 14's bathroom was on. He stared at it, confused, because the main room was pitch black, and he told us that as he was looking, A hand reached out from inside the brightly lit bathroom. He specifically described it as bone white, unnaturally pale, with long, thin fingers. It reached around the doorframe, grabbed the handle, and slowly pulled the bathroom door shut. He even heard the distinct click of the latch. Nolan said he instantly dove back under his covers, completely ignoring his need to pee, and lay there shivering until the sun came up. He begged us to switch beds with him, but honestly, none of us were brave enough to take the window spot after that. We told him to just pitch in, to buy a couple of cheap desk fans, so we could permanently close our window at night. At this point, 3 of us were actively trying to get the dorm management to move us to a different room, but the dorms were at maximum capacity. There was a waiting list, and worse, Caleb was actively fighting against us moving. He claimed he liked our spot at the end of the hall because it was quieter, but we all knew the real reason. He had his eye on a couple of girls in room 12 and 13, and being at our end of the hall meant he got to see them walk by every single day. He told us we were being paranoid idiots, that if the ghost was really that bad, the whole building would be empty. He kept saying that her family probably performed a ritual to take her spirit back to her hometown, so there was nothing to worry about. He was so arrogant about it. I really wish he hadn't been. The third incident happened to Victor. He had a girlfriend who went to a different university, and since the 4 of us were always making noise in the room, he would usually step out into the hallway around 9 or 10 p.m. to call her. He told us he was sitting against the wall just outside our door, talking to his girl. The hallway was busy at first, people walking to the showers, kids yelling across the fence, but eventually, it quieted down. Victor was looking down at his phone, deeply engaged in conversation, when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Down at the absolute opposite end of the hallway near room 1 and the main stairwell, a girl was walking toward him. He told us he didn't think anything of it. Lots of girls took night classes and came back late. She was walking normally, hugging a binder to her chest. He kept talking on the phone, occasionally glancing up. She walked past room 1, room 2, room 3. Just a slow, steady, quiet pace. But as she got closer to our end of the hall, the hallway was completely dead. No one else was around. Victor said that when she passed room 12, his chest started to feel tight. When she passed room 13, completely ignoring the open doors and the light spilling into the hallway, his instincts started screaming at him. He said his legs literally locked up. He couldn't stand up. He couldn't speak into his phone. He just watched in absolute silence. The girl reached room 14. She turned, pushed the closed door open effortlessly, walked inside, went straight to the bathroom, and pulled the door shut behind her with that same metallic clack. Victor dropped his phone, scrambled backward on his hands and knees, and practically threw himself into our room, pale as a ghost. He begged Caleb to agree to move, but Caleb still refused. He just laughed at Victor, calling him a coward, saying we were all feeding into each other's delusions. And that brings us to the Saturday night. It was someone's birthday. I honestly can't even remember whose. The fear of what happened completely erased those details. We bought a cheap cake, some snacks, and a case of beer. Because we were drinking, we had our door and window wide open to air out the smell. Nolan, Victor, and I explicitly positioned ourselves so our backs were facing the door. We wanted to look into our room, not out into the hallway, but Caleb, sitting right in the middle of us, faced the door head on. He was looking directly into the dark, open space of the hallway, and directly at the closed door of room 14. We had been drinking for about an hour. It was getting late, maybe past 10 p.m. We were all a little buzzed. Suddenly, Caleb smirks, points his beer can toward the hallway, and says, loud enough for anyone to hear, that our little ghost friend was opening her door. My heart stopped. We all slowly turned our heads. The door to room 14 was wide open. Victor stammered, asking Caleb if he actually saw someone open it. Caleb just scoffed, took a sip of his beer, and said it was probably just the wind blowing it open. But I had watched the guard lock that door. I knew it wasn't the wind. We begged Caleb to stop joking around, to show some respect, but he just told us to shut up and keep drinking. About 10 minutes later, Victor whispered that the door was closed again. We looked, and sure enough, it was shut tight. No sound, no wind, just soot. We tried to focus on the beers, but maybe 20 minutes later, I noticed Caleb stopped talking. I looked at him. He was in the middle of bringing his beer to his mouth, but he had frozen completely solid. I need to explain exactly how wrong he looked right then, because it's burned into my memory. He didn't drop his drink. He just held it halfway to his face, his eyes blown wide open, staring directly past me and into the hallway. I watched the condensation from his cold beer gather into a thick drop, slide down the aluminum can, and drip onto his jeans, but he didn't even flinch. His jaw was slack. He wasn't blinking. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Nolan waved a hand in front of his face, asking if he was too drunk. Caleb didn't look at us. Without moving his eyes, he slowly tilted his entire upper body backward, shrinking away from the doorway, and in this impossibly thin, trembling voice, he told us to close the door. He didn't yell. He begged, "Close the door." Nolan scrambled up and slammed our main door shut, throwing the deadbolt. Victor locked the window. We grabbed Caleb, shaking him, asking what the hell he saw. He was hyperventilating, clutching his chest like he was having a heart attack. He kept muttering that it was real, that we were right, over and over again. When he finally caught his breath, he told us that he saw the bathroom door inside room 14 open. He saw the pale hand, and then he saw her step out. He said she was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her hair hanging down in long, wet strands over her face. She stepped out of the bathroom, turned her head slowly, and locked eyes directly with him through the open doors. Then, she raised her hand and pointed a single long finger right at his face. Caleb said she started moving toward him, but her legs weren't moving. She was just gliding, hovering inches above the tile floor, pointing directly at his eyes, getting closer and closer to our doorway. He said the moment she reached the threshold of our room, her face twisted into something horrific. She vanished into thin air, and the door to room 14 slowly swung shut on its own. Caleb was completely broken. This guy who spent weeks mocking us was now curled up on his bunk, refusing to speak, refusing to look anywhere but the ceiling. He told us he was ready to move. He said he would go to the office first thing in the morning and beg them. We tried to calm him down. We told him the door was locked, that we were safe. Eventually, exhaustion and the alcohol took over, and we all passed out in our bunks. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe around 3:15 a.m., but I woke up needing to use the restroom. I groggily climbed down from my top bunk, went into our small attached bathroom, did my business, and stepped back out. I hadn't turned the bathroom light off yet, so it was casting this long, pale yellow beam across the dark room. The light fell directly onto Caleb's top bunk. My breath hitched in my throat. Holy fucking shit. Caleb was sitting up, but the ceiling was so low that he couldn't sit straight. He was sitting completely cross-legged, his neck bent at this agonizing, unnatural 90-degree angle, with the top of his head pressed flat against the ceiling plaster. He wasn't looking at the wall. He had his head tilted sideways, staring directly down at me in the dark, and he was smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was this wide, strained, ear-to-ear grin that didn't reach his dead, empty eyes. And while he stared at me, his hand was moving through the air next to his head, making slow, rhythmic sweeping motions. He was brushing invisible, waist-length hair. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward against the bathroom door, my foot kicking a metal trash can. The noise was deafening in the quiet room. Victor and Nolan instantly woke up, panicked by the noise. They fumbled for the main light switch and flipped it on. The harsh fluorescent light hit Caleb. He instantly collapsed sideways onto his mattress, gasping for air like someone who had just been pulled underwater. We scrambled up the ladder, shaking him violently. He looked at us with complete confusion, his eyes darting around the room. We asked him what the hell he was doing sitting like that, brushing his hair and smiling at me in the dark. He looked at us, totally blank, and said he was just sleeping. He said he was having a nice dream, where a girl from across the hall was holding his hand and taking him for a walk in the dark. We didn't let him sleep for the rest of the night. We pulled him down to the floor, turned every light on, and forced him to talk to us until the sun finally came up. We were genuinely terrified that if he closed his eyes again, whatever was hollowing out his mind would finish the job and he wouldn't wake up as Caleb anymore. The moment the gates opened at 6 a.m., we practically dragged him out of the dorm and walked him to a large Buddhist temple nearby. He walked like a zombie the whole way, dragging his feet, staring blankly at the pavement. It wasn't until he sat in the main hall of the temple for 3 hours, surrounded by the chanting and the incense, that the heavy fog seemed to finally lift from his eyes, and he realized what had actually happened. We never went back to that room to sleep. We pooled our money, chipping in a few $100,000 dong, maybe $20 each, which was a lot for us back then, and rented a dingy motel room down the street for a week while we fought with the administration to reassign us. Eventually, they split us up and shoved us into other overcrowded rooms just to shut us up. I ended up staying there, finishing my degree, and eventually moving back to my hometown to work. But honestly, I have no idea if that girl's spirit ever actually moved on, or if she's still just trapped there. A few years later, I actually had to go back to the university to pick up some paperwork, and I decided to swing by the old dorms to check on some underclassmen I knew. They told me that both room 14 and room 27 are just completely gone now. Like the kids living on that floor today don't even know the room numbers anymore. All they know is that at the absolute dead end of the hallway, there are just 2 heavy, unmarked storage doors facing each other in the dark. This happened a long time ago, probably 15 or 16 years back, when I was in the 9th grade. I grew up in this really poor, isolated village way down south, far outside of Saigon. Our local middle school was what you'd call a true rural school. Up until the 8th grade, our classrooms literally had dirt floors and roofs made of woven leaves and cheap tin that would bake you alive in the summer. It was rough. But then, right before my 9th grade year, the government finally funneled some money down to our district to upgrade public facilities. It was a huge deal for us. They tore down the old shacks and built this actual solid concrete school with a real cafeteria and a massive courtyard for us to play soccer, though it wasn't grass, just this hard, unforgiving cement that would tear your knees up if you fell. But here's the thing about government funding in those small towns. The money never quite stretches as far as it's supposed to. They managed to build the main classrooms and the yard, but they completely ran out of budget for the perimeter walls, the front gates, and the security guard house. Because the school year had already started, the principal decided they would just wait until the long Lunar New Year break to finish the fences. So, for the entire first half of my 9th grade year, our school was just this open, exposed concrete complex sitting in the middle of overgrown fields, completely accessible to anyone at any time of day or night. And man, we were absolute menaces. You have to understand, in a poor farming village where there's literally no entertainment, no tall buildings, no concrete structures at all besides the police station, a brand new, open school is like an amusement park for bored kids. Once the sun went down, me and all the other middle schoolers would sneak into the courtyard. We didn't have bad intentions at first, but you know how mob mentality works. It started with just playing soccer in the dark, and then it escalated to drawing crap all over the freshly painted walls, leaving our trash everywhere. And I'm actually ashamed to admit this, some of the really messed up kids would literally take a shit right on the classroom floors just to spite the teachers they hated. The school only had one janitor/security guard, this older guy named Trent. But Trent didn't have a guardhouse to sleep in, so he would just lock the classroom doors, beat the big ceremonial drum to signal the end of the day, and then he'd go home to his family. He'd try to come back at night to chase us out, But the second he turned his back, we just swarmed right back in like roaches. It was a completely screwed up situation for the faculty. So, the principal got desperate. He pulled aside our PE teacher. Let's call him Tyler. Tyler was this brand new, fresh out of college guy, maybe 25 years old, tops. Honestly, looking back now, he was just a kid himself, younger than I am today. The principal basically forced Tyler to take on unpaid night guard duties alongside Trent, just to walk the perimeter until 10 p.m. and scare the kids away. Tyler was pissed. I mean, totally understandably. He was a young guy. He wanted to finish his shift, go out, drink some beers with his buddies, and smoke cigarettes at the local cafes, not babysit a bunch of feral preteens in the dark. So, Tyler, being the lazy but somewhat clever guy he was, came up with a psychological warfare tactic to keep us out. Since he taught physical education to every single class from 6th to 9th grade, he decided to use his class time to plant a seed. I still vividly remember the day he did it to our class. We were out in the blazing morning sun, sweating through our uniforms, when he suddenly cut the drills short about 30 minutes in. We were thrilled, obviously. He told us all to gather around him on the concrete, lowering his voice like he was letting us in on some massive illegal secret. He told us that he cared about us too much to let us get hurt and that the principal was trying to cover up the dark history of the school. He explicitly warned us not to tell anyone else what he was about to say, which is the ultimate hook for a bunch of gossipy kids. Then he spun these incredibly elaborate, terrifying ghost stories. He told us that years ago, before the school was downgraded to a middle school, a 12th grade girl got her heart broken and hung herself from the rafters of the old thatched roofs, and that if you walked by the school at night, you could hear the sickening sound of a rope creaking and see her hanging body floating back and forth in the empty classrooms. But he didn't stop there. He told us another story about a kid who snuck into the school at night to sleep because he was running away from home. Tyler swore that the kid was targeted by an old dark entity that lived in the soil, and that the entity possessed him and forced him to walk in endless, mindless circles around the courtyard, all night long, until the morning market vendors found him completely catatonic, his face pale and his mind just gone. He capped it off with a story about a previous security guard who drank himself to death on the job and still wandered the perimeter, offering poisoned fruit to anyone who trespassed. He delivered these stories with such deadpan, chilling sincerity. And you have to realize, to a bunch of superstitious, gullible 12 and 13-year-olds in a rural village, hearing an adult, a teacher, an authority figure, confirm that monsters are real, it was absolute gospel. It scared the living crap out of us. And his plan worked flawlessly. Within a week, the rumor spread like wildfire through the entire student body. Nobody, and I mean nobody, dared to step a single foot near that school after sunset. The place was like a graveyard. Tyler got praised by the administration for single-handedly solving the vandalism problem, and he got his nights back to go out drinking. It was the perfect lie. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. About a month passed. The stories became accepted facts, and the school remained completely abandoned at night. But I had this buddy. Let's call him Quinn. Quinn was that kid, the one who always had to push boundaries, the one who questioned everything, the one who was just a little too brave for his own good. We were hanging out at a local drink stand one evening, just chewing on sugarcane, when Quinn casually asked if I wanted to go into the school that night. I looked at him like he had lost his damn mind. I reminded him about the hanging girl, the dead guard, the entity that drags you in circles. But Quinn just scoffed. He told me he had been doing his own investigating. His older brother, who was already married and living in the city, had gone to that same school a decade ago. Quinn's brother confirmed that our school had never, ever been a high school. There were no 12th graders. And Quinn's mom, who sold vegetables at the morning market right next to the school, had never heard a single vendor talk about finding a catatonic kid walking in circles. In a village where everyone knows everything about everyone, a story like that wouldn't just be a secret. Quinn had figured it out. He knew Tyler was full of it. He looked at me with this smug grin and laid out his plan. He wanted us to go in, grab some chalk, and write our names all over the walls. He said that once the other kids saw our graffiti the next morning, they'd realize the ghosts were fake, and we'd have our nighttime hangout spot back before the fences got built after the holidays. I was terrified, honestly. My brain understood his logic, but my gut was just twisting itself into knots. But peer pressure at that age is a hell of a drug. Quinn essentially cornered me, telling me that I only had to stand by the entrance and keep watch, just so I could be his witness the next day to prove he went in. Like an idiot, I agreed. It was maybe around 8:30 p.m. when we finally walked toward the school. The village was already dead quiet. It was that specific type of rural darkness that feels heavy, like the shadows have actual physical weight to them. There were no streetlights, just the pale moonlight cutting through the tops of the coconut trees, casting these long, jagged shapes across the dirt road. When we got to the school, there was no gate, just two massive, unfinished concrete pillars sticking out of the ground like giant tombstones. Quinn walked right between them without hesitating. I stopped at the threshold. The silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was that high-pitched, ringing silence that makes your ears hurt. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching Quinn wander around the dark courtyard. The wind rustled the bamboo groves behind the cafeteria, and every time the leaves scraped together, my heart did a miserable little flip. I kept desperately trying to rationalize everything. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just a stray dog, just the buildings settling. My brain was working in overdrive to deny the sheer, primal bad vibe I was getting from the place. After about 10 minutes of absolutely nothing happening, the tension kind of broke. Quinn waved at me from across the yard, proving his point. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, mixed with a little bit of embarrassment for being such a coward. I took a deep breath, crossed the threshold, and jogged over to him. Quinn whispered that we needed to go inside one of the actual classrooms to find some colored chalk. We walked down the open-air corridor of the 9th grade wing. The doors weren't padlocked, just pulled shut. Quinn reached out and pushed the door to classroom 9A1 open. The hinges gave this faint metallic squeal. We stepped inside. The room smelled like fresh concrete, dust and cheap chalk. The moonlight spilled through the glassless window frames, illuminating the rows of empty wooden desks. We were just standing there, letting our eyes adjust to the gloom, when my entire reality just shattered. The silence was absolutely suffocating, until I heard this slow, deliberate scraping sound from the classroom, right next door to ours, which immediately escalated into this deafening, violent crashing noise. And I mean, it sounded literally like 10 full-grown men were just picking up heavy wooden desks and violently hurling them against the concrete walls over and over again, the wood splintering and the metal legs screeching against the floor in this chaotic, aggressive frenzy. It was so loud, the vibrations were traveling up through the soles of my cheap sandals. I didn't think. I didn't try to look through the window. I didn't try to rationalize it. I just experienced this pure, blinding surge of animal panic. I screamed. I didn't even yell words, just this guttural, pathetic noise, and I spun around and ran. I ran so freaking fast my feet barely registered the concrete. I didn't look back. I just blindly sprinted out of the classroom, across the courtyard, past the unfinished pillars, and down the dirt road toward my house. I was squinting my eyes. You know, that thing kids do when they're terrified, where they squint their eyes almost completely shut so they don't accidentally see a ghost while they're running? Yeah, I did that all the way to my front door. I just assumed Quinn was right behind me. I heard my own rapid footsteps and my own ragged breathing, and I just figured he was matching my pace. But when I slammed my front door shut and locked it, leaning against the wood and gasping for air, I realized I was alone. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I just lay in my bed, shaking, waiting for the sun to come up. The next morning, I went to school, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I immediately scanned the courtyard for Quinn. He wasn't there. He didn't show up for first period, or second. Our homeroom teacher noticed his absence. Back then, if a kid was sick for a few days, The whole class would organize a visit to their house. It was a whole formal thing. So, after school, our teacher led a group of us over to Quinn's place. When we got there, the atmosphere was completely wrong. It felt heavy. The teacher sat in the front room with Quinn's parents, sipping tea, while we were told to go to the back bedroom to see him. I remember looking at his parents' faces. They looked hollowed out, their eyes red and puffy, speaking in these hushed, shaky tones to the teacher. We all crowded into Quinn's room. He was lying on his bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the ceiling. The other kids were doing that fake, polite thing, asking him how he was doing, telling him they brought him some fruit. It was so agonizingly awkward. Quinn just gave these weak nods, not really focusing on anyone. Eventually, the other kids got bored and wandered out to the front yard. I stayed behind. I sat on the edge of his bed, my stomach doing backflips. I leaned in and asked him what the hell happened, why he didn't run with me. Quinn slowly turned his head to look at me, and his eyes, they just looked dead. He told me in a whisper that he didn't run away. He told me he was trapped in the school all night. I was so confused. I told him that made no sense, that I heard the crashing. I screamed and I ran, and I thought he was right on my heels. Quinn swallowed hard. He told me that when the crashing started, I bolted first. He was paralyzed for a second, but then he snapped out of it and tried to follow me. He ran out of the classroom door, squinting his eyes tight in the dark just like I did, but he only made it a few steps before he slammed chest first into a person. He bounced off and fell hard on his back. He scrambled to sit up, expecting to see me, or maybe Trent the security guard, or Tyler the PE teacher. But it wasn't them. Standing over him was a shadow. It was the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but it was entirely pitch black, darker than the night around them. Quinn was absolutely terrified. He thought it was Tyler catching us breaking in, so he started stammering out apologies, begging the teacher not to tell his parents. The shadow didn't say anything at first. It just reached down and grabbed Quinn's wrist. Quinn told me the grip was like a vice, cold and impossibly strong. It hoisted him up to his feet so violently it almost dislocated his shoulder. And then, the entity spoke. It didn't yell. It just uttered one word, over and over, in this flat, hollow frequency that vibrated right through Quinn's skull. Go, go, go. And it started walking, dragging Quinn along with it. Quinn was crying, begging, apologizing, pulling against the grip, but the entity didn't even flinch. It just kept saying, go, 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 dragging him across the courtyard, down the corridors, around the back of the cafeteria. Quinn told me they walked for hours. He was begging the entity to let him rest. His legs were giving out, but the grip never loosened. It was a physical impossibility. The schoolyard wasn't that big, but somehow they just kept walking in this endless, looping nightmare. Quinn's body eventually gave out. He said the exhaustion was unnatural, like his literal life force was being siphoned out of him through the entity's hand. He started convulsing, foaming at the mouth, fading in and out of consciousness. The last thing he remembered before completely passing out was the feeling of his own spit running down his chin and the relentless pulling on his arm. Trent found him the next morning at sunrise, unconscious, lying on top of a desk in the exact same classroom we had initially walked into. Hearing that, I felt like all the blood drained out of my body. The realization hit me like a freight train. Tyler's fake story. The entity that drags you in circles until you lose your mind. It wasn't just a story anymore. Quinn never came back to our school. His parents pulled him out and transferred him to a different district miles away. Tyler, the PE teacher, got quietly fired after Quinn's parents raised hell with the administration, though they couldn't exactly put summoned a demon on his termination papers. But the tragedy didn't end there. The trauma of that night completely broke Quinn. Over the next few months, he started acting erratic. He'd get these weird, manic episodes where he'd just stare at walls and giggle, or he wouldn't recognize me when I tried to visit him. His mind was just fracturing. And then, about 6 months later, Quinn was riding on the back of his dad's motorcycle, heading to the morning market. They were just cruising down a normal road when Quinn suddenly had a massive freakout. He started screaming, thrashing around, and he just threw himself off the moving bike. He didn't hit the ground. He stumbled and fell directly into the path of another motorcycle coming from the opposite direction. The handlebar clipped him right in the throat. It wasn't even a high-speed crash, but it hit the exact wrong spot. Quinn died instantly, just like that, gone. After his death, the entire village completely blew up. The rumors spread everywhere that the school actually had a real ghost. It became a massive deal, and the school administration had to step in to try and handle the panic. A bunch of students ended up transferring out of the school entirely because everyone was so terrified. But as for me, I stayed. I just kept going to that same school. By the time the next school year rolled around, they had finally finished building the perimeter walls and the front gates, so the place was actually secure. Plus, I was only scheduled for morning classes from then on. So, in the bright daylight with a proper fence, I just didn't feel scared of it anymore. You can just call me Nellie. I'm 30, from a sleepy southern province called Sok Trang. And my dad, well, he was a strict old-school electrician who loved me to death but was tough as nails. Anyway, this whole thing traces back to a really bizarre irony in my life. I had this crippling phobia of dogs after getting bitten as a little kid, like full-on panic attacks if I saw one on the street. But somehow, surviving the absolute worst night of my life back in middle school was the exact thing that made me obsessed with them. It all started when I was just going into 7th grade. In my hometown, the schools were all separated by age groups, so the elementary, middle, and high schools were completely different campuses, scattered a few miles apart. My dad, being the incredibly calculating and protective guy that he was, decided to pick up a second job doing evening electrical maintenance over at the local high school. He didn't even need the money. He just wanted to get on a first-name basis with the security guards, the janitors, the teachers, and the principal, so that by the time I was old enough to go there, he'd have the path completely paved for me. So, one evening, he picked me up from my middle school and took a detour. Instead of taking the right turn to go home, he hooked a left toward the high school, mumbling something about needing to swap out some bad starters on those old, flickering fluorescent tube lights in the hallways. It was probably around 6:15 or 6:20 p.m., and the sun was already dipping low, casting these long, stretched-out shadows across the concrete courtyard. The security guard had apparently stepped out for dinner, so the entire massive U-shaped campus was completely abandoned. My dad parked his bike, handed me my backpack, and told me to just sit on this cold stone bench right next to the guardhouse at the main gate. He strictly told me not to wander off, saying he'd be in and out in maybe 20 minutes, and then he'd take me to get ice cream. I just sat there, swinging my legs, feeling that heavy, humid evening air settling in. It was so incredibly boring that I just started scanning the buildings, trying to figure out the layout of where I'd be studying in a few years. I looked past the dark classrooms on the first floor, and my eyes naturally drifted toward the far end of the right wing where the bathrooms were. Because the campus was so huge, I really had to squint, but I could make out the signs for the boys' and girls' restrooms sitting side by side. As I was staring at the girls' bathroom, I saw the heavy wooden door slowly creak open, just about 2 hand widths wide. I immediately stopped swinging my legs. Somebody poked their head out from the dark gap, but their hair was so long and unkempt that it completely covered their face, falling like a thick black curtain. The person kind of peeked to the left, lingered for a second, and then pulled their head back in, and the door softly clicked shut. My 12-year-old brain immediately started running the denial loop. I completely convinced myself that it was just some rebellious high school girl who had skipped class and was hiding in the bathroom to smoke. Or maybe she was just waiting for her strict parents to pass by so she could sneak out to hang with her boyfriend. Stuff like that happened all the time. I kind of chuckled to myself, feeling like I had just busted someone's secret. But then, A couple of minutes later, I suddenly had to pee. Normally, the thought of walking into a dark, empty school bathroom would freak me out, but my dad was literally somewhere in the building fixing the lights. I felt this weird sense of ownership, like, my dad practically works here. I have every right to use the restroom. So I hopped off the bench and started making the long walk across the empty courtyard. I pushed open the heavy main door to the girls' room, stepping into that familiar smell of cheap industrial bleach and damp concrete. There was a second set of swinging doors leading to the actual stalls. I just picked the very first stall, not wanting to go too deep into the room, and did my business without a second thought. When I came out, I walked over to the long row of sinks near the main entrance to wash my hands. The only light in the room was whatever the setting sun was bleeding through the open doorway behind me, casting this murky grayish tint over the mirrors. I had my head down, scrubbing my hands under the faucet, when I heard this agonizingly slow, grinding creak of rusted metal hinges coming from the stall right behind me. The sound was so unnatural that the hair on my arms stood straight up before my brain even processed it. I slowly turned my head, dripping water all over the floor, and looked back at the stalls. It was the girl. She had pushed the stall door open and was leaning her head out, exactly like she did earlier. Her left hand was gripping the edge of the wood, and her long, stringy black hair was still draping over her face. She slowly turned her head to the left, as if checking the room, and then she turned her head to the right, stopping perfectly to face me. We were standing maybe 10 feet apart. I couldn't breathe. I was completely frozen, my mind desperately trying to figure out why this high schooler was acting so weird. Then she slowly raised her right hand, reached up to her face, and deliberately tucked the thick curtain of hair behind her ear. My stomach violently dropped. I felt all the blood rush out of my head in a single second. She didn't have a face. There were no eyes. There was no nose. There was no mouth or eyebrows or cheekbones. It was just a blank, fleshy slab of skin that was unnervingly smooth, almost like the bottom of a hot iron, but it had these horizontal wrinkled creases running across it, exactly like the folds on the palm of a human hand. She was intentionally showing it to me. She moved her head slightly, as if she was proudly displaying this sickening, unnatural void where a human face should be. Before I could even open my mouth to scream, the massive wooden door at the main entrance slammed shut with a deafening crash, sending this unnatural, freezing gust of wind slapping violently against my back. The entire bathroom went pitch black. Total, suffocating darkness. I completely lost my mind. I hurled myself at the main door, screaming at the top of my lungs, slamming my tiny fists against the wood so hard I could feel my knuckles bruising. I was shrieking for my dad, begging for someone to help me. Just pure, primal panic tearing up my throat. I was so terrified of whatever was standing behind me in the dark that my brain just short-circuited, and I passed out cold on the wet tiles. I don't know how long I was out, maybe a few minutes, but I woke up gasping for air, the image of that blank, fleshy palm face searing into my mind, and the panic immediately spiked again, making me pass out a second time. It was this agonizing loop of waking up in the dark, remembering the horror, and my body just shutting down to protect itself. Eventually, through the haze, I heard a muffled voice from outside. It was my dad. He was pacing around the courtyard, calling my name, sounding annoyed at first, and then increasingly frantic. I dragged myself up against the door and started sobbing, screaming that I was right there, that I was locked in the bathroom. I heard his heavy work boots jogging closer, stopping right on the other side of the door. I heard him grab the handle and aggressively jiggle it. I was screaming so hard my throat tasted like blood, begging him to open the freaking door and save me, but he just sighed. He mumbled out loud, wondering if the janitor had locked the bathroom and where the hell I could have wandered off to. We were inches apart, separated by maybe an inch of cheap wood, and he couldn't hear a single sound I was making. It was like the bathroom had been completely sucked into a vacuum, entirely cut off from the reality he was standing in. I heard his footsteps fade away as he went to check the boys' bathroom next door, and that's when the sheer hopelessness broke me. I collapsed on the floor and lost consciousness again, and this time, I was out for a long time. What I found out later was that my dad had panicked. He couldn't find me anywhere on the grounds, and he remembered hearing the local rumors about the school being severely haunted. In a desperate move, he sprinted back to our neighborhood, didn't even tell my mom what was happening because she would have killed him, and borrowed a massive black dog from our neighbor. Now remember, I was deathly afraid of dogs, but my dad knew that dogs could see things we couldn't, and black dogs specifically were known in our culture to aggressively ward off spirits. He rode his bike back to the school with the dog balancing on the front. He said the absolute second he kicked the kickstand down, the dog bolted. It sprinted in a straight line across the courtyard, beelining directly for the girls' bathroom, and immediately started viciously scratching at the door, letting out these deep, guttural barks that echoed off the walls. My dad ran over, grabbed the handle, and it was still locked tight. But the dog wouldn't stop going crazy at the wood. My dad finally realized I was in there, trapped by something he couldn't see. He completely lost his temper, grabbed a heavy hammer and a screwdriver from his tool belt, and just violently smashed the wooden door handle to pieces until the door splintered open. The light flooded in. I was lying on the floor, barely breathing, completely drained of life. He scooped me up, threw me on his bike, and rushed me home. I ran a brutal fever for days. My dad quit the maintenance job immediately. He later found out from the older staff that years ago, before the school had even built the second floor, a senior girl had gotten pregnant, was abandoned by her boyfriend, and had hung herself in that exact bathroom stall. When the government funded the school expansion, they built upward, but they never changed the layout of the ground floor. That girl's despair was permanently anchored to those tiles, and for whatever reason, she decided to show herself to me. And from that day forward, my paralyzing fear of dogs completely vanished. A dog had literally broken through a paranormal barrier to find me when my own father couldn't even hear my screams. I was completely obsessed with them, but the bitter irony was that my dad, who was so deeply traumatized by seeing my leg chewed up when I was a toddler, absolutely refused to let me own one. The rule was set in stone, and as he got older, he only got more stubborn. Fast forward almost 2 decades. I was a grown woman, freshly married. My dad was so overprotective that he basically forced my husband to move into our family home, acting like an absolute tyrant. He was the definition of an old-school patriarch. His house, his rules. About 6 months into our marriage, my husband, not fully grasping the absolute sheer terror of my dad's temper, brought home a fluffy white rescue pup that we named Banjo. All hell broke loose. My dad screamed that dog hair was going to ruin the house, that we were filthy, and he gave us an ultimatum. Either the dog goes, or we get the hell out of his house. For me, this was my one chance in a lifetime to finally have a dog. I looked at my husband, and we made the insane decision to leave. We were dead broke. We actually had to sell my wedding gold just to afford the deposit on a crumbling tiny rental room about 500 meters away from my family home. It was a claustrophobic little box. We parked our motorbike inside on the ground floor, where Banjo would sleep underneath it, and my husband and I slept up on a cramped wooden loft. Almost immediately, things felt incredibly wrong. During our very first week, we'd be trying to sleep on the loft, and we'd hear this distinct clanking sound coming from the tiny kitchenette right below us. It sounded like someone slowly lifting the metal spatulas and pans and letting them drop onto the counter. My husband just brushed it off, totally rationalizing it. He kept saying it was probably just mice, or maybe Banjo was bumping into the pots, while wandering around in the dark. He even promised to buy a drill and hang all the pans high up on the wall the next day. But the next night, the noise happened again. I leaned over the loft railing and looked down into the dark. Banjo wasn't wandering around at all. She was crammed as far back under the motorbike engine as she could possibly fit, shaking. I just told myself she was a sensitive breed, probably just spooked by a rat. You have to understand, when you sacrifice everything and sell your wedding jewelry just to live somewhere, your brain absolutely refuses to admit that the place is fundamentally screwed up. But then Banjo started acting out. She went from being this sweet, obedient pup during the day to an absolute nightmare at night. She would stare into the dark corners of the room and bark aggressively for hours. The neighbors started banging on our walls, threatening to complain to the landlord. My husband would get so frustrated he'd go down and physically smack her to make her quiet down. Things peaked a few days later when my husband caught a brutal fever. We had no money for a hospital, so he was just sweating it out on the loft mattress, burning up at like 39 or 40 degrees Celsius. Sometime deep in the night, maybe around 2:43 a.m. or something, he was groaning that his body was on fire. I climbed down the steep wooden ladder to boil some water so I could wipe him down with a damp towel. I didn't turn on the main lights, just the tiny bulb over the kitchen sink, leaving the staircase area completely shrouded in heavy shadows. While I was waiting for the water to boil, Banjo started growling viciously from under the bike, staring directly at the stairs. I hissed at her to shut up, terrified she was going to wake up my sick husband. As I wrung out the wet towel, I glanced over at the staircase and saw a tall, dark silhouette slowly walking down the steps. I instantly assumed it was my husband. I felt this surge of annoyance and pity. I told him to just go back upstairs, warning him that the stairs were steep, and if he passed out and broke his arm, we literally couldn't afford a cast for him. The figure didn't answer. It just kept walking down in absolute silence, and the dog was going absolutely ballistic now, barking so hard she was choking on her own spit. I turned back to the sink for a split second to grab the bowl of water. When I turned around to tell my husband to go back to bed, there was nobody there. The figure had stepped off the bottom stair and just ceased to exist. A cold sweat broke out over my entire body. I gripped the bowl so hard my fingers ached, and I practically scrambled up the ladder, desperate to get back to the safety of the mattress. I sat down next to my husband and immediately started wiping his forehead with the cold towel. He groaned, shifted his weight, and weakly complained, asking me why the hell I had been pacing back and forth, stepping over his body for the last 20 minutes. He said I kept kicking his legs every time I stepped over him, and his joints were already aching from the fever. My heart completely stopped. I stared at him in the dim light, my voice trembling as I told him I had been downstairs boiling water the entire time. I only stepped over him once when I left the bed. He looked at me, his feverish eyes widening slightly, and then he just stayed completely silent. We both knew right then there was a ghost pacing around our loft, and it had stepped right over his sick body. The very next day, the energy in the room turned violently hostile. Banjo was pacing around like she had rabies. She was so stressed out that she literally chewed the rubber grips off the motorbike handles and shredded our laundry. I was so exhausted and terrified that I actually spanked her really hard, yelling at her that she was the reason we were trapped in this awful place. I still hate myself for doing that. That night, my husband was recovering, finally sleeping deeply. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when Banjo started barking downstairs again. I banged on the floorboards, telling her to shut up. She went quiet for a bit, but then the sounds changed. It wasn't just barking anymore. It sounded like a brutal, chaotic struggle coming from the tiny bathroom on the ground floor. I heard plastic buckets being thrown around, crashing against the tiles, and Banjo letting out these high-pitched, desperate yelps, like she was fighting for her life against a rabid animal. It went on for nearly 30 minutes, and I am so deeply ashamed to admit this, but I was too absolutely terrified to climb down those stairs and check on her. I just hid under the blanket, silently praying for morning to come. When the sun finally came up, my husband and I rushed downstairs. The sight made my stomach heave. The entire ground floor was covered in tufts of white fur. It looked like a pillow had exploded. I slowly pushed the bathroom door open, and there was Banjo. She was lying perfectly still on the wet, filthy tiles, her head resting on her paws, panting heavily with her tongue lolling out. She looked up at me, her eyes completely exhausted and pleading. The plastic buckets were shattered. Soap powder was everywhere, and smeared across the floor, mixing with the water, were thick, swirling streaks of fresh blood. I dropped to my knees, sobbing uncontrollably. When I reached out to touch her, I saw the extent of the damage. Someone, or something, had violently ripped massive clumps of fur right off her body. There were huge, raw pink patches of exposed skin on her neck, her thighs, and her lower back. It didn't look like bite marks. It looked like a pair of human hands had grabbed her fur by the roots and forcefully ripped it out of her flesh. My husband and I wrapped her in a blanket and sprinted to the only vet clinic in town. The veterinarian took one look at Banjo's injuries and then looked at us with absolute, thinly veiled disgust. He heavily implied that we were abusing our pet, bluntly stating that dog fights leave puncture wounds and tears, not perfectly plucked bald patches. He essentially accused us of torturing her. We didn't even try to argue. We just paid for the stitches and the medicine and left her there to be hospitalized for a few days. Going back to that empty, violated rental room that night broke me. We sat in the dark, listening to the pipes rattle, and I couldn't take it anymore. I completely broke down, crying so hard I couldn't breathe, and begged my husband to let me call my dad. I dialed his number and just bawled into the receiver. I told him everything: the shadow, the footsteps, the brutal attack on Banjo. I fully expected him to scream at me, to tell me I deserved it for disobeying him. Instead, he just went completely quiet and said he was on his way. 30 minutes later, he was standing at our door. He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He just looked around the oppressive little room and ordered us to pack our bags immediately. He told us to forget the deposit, forget the money, and just get out. And then he gruffly mumbled that once the dog was healed, we could bring her to the house and he'd help us build a pen for her. I hugged him so tight. It was the first time I had hugged him like that since I was a little girl running out of that haunted school bathroom. We got out of there, and eventually, things went back to normal as they can be. My dad even secretly started feeding Banjo sausages from the dinner table when he thought I wasn't looking, which is a miracle in itself. But I need to ask you guys something, because this question has been eating me alive for years. Can a ghost actually physically tear chunks of flesh and fur off a living creature? Have you ever heard of a haunting that leaves that kind of physical, bloody proof? Drop a comment if you know anything, because I still wake up in cold sweats wondering, what would it have done to me if it hadn't taken its anger out on my dog? Thanks for listening to me ramble about my messed up life choices. Please, trust your pets when they stare into the dark, and stay safe out there.